Hello and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Abdurrahim Kashu and you are watching L24 News Russia-Ukraine special coverage. As Russia forces and focuses its fire on Ukraine's south and east, outgunned fighters continue to resist capitulation in final holdout. The Azovstal steel plant in the southern part of the city of Mariupol. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky acknowledged that Russian forces had captured most of the city in crushing siege. Mariupol's mayor made a renewed appeal Friday for full evacuation and said that more 100,000 people remain trapped in the city. Images provided to Washington Post by Maxar Technology showed a mass grave outside the city, evidence of war crimes against civilians, according to Ukrainian officials. So, to this point, why didn't Ukraine approve the call for surrender in Mariupol, since the city is already taken by the Russians, and how Russia will try to defend itself again against the new mass grave in Mariupol after that one of Bucha? Numerous questions are directed to our panel of guests. We have Mr. Tom O'Connor, senior foreign policy writer at Newsweek Staten Island from New York, USA, and Mr. Alvydas Medalinskas, political analyst and an international expert on the Donbas region from Lithuania. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us in this debate. The show begins right after this break. Satellite images published by the American company Maxar Technology show, according to the company, the existence of a site of mass graves in the northwest of Manhush, a village 20 kilometers west of Mariupol. 5 photos captured between April 3rd and March 19 show that what appears to be in appearance of a grave extending just below the road in the upper part of the images. Mr. Alvydas, since you are close to the battlefield, sharing the border with Poland as well as Belarus, I will be starting with you. How can you describe these new satellite images of mass grave in Mariupol? Is it a real or another made-up story, as Russians claimed that one of Bucha?
I think it's a real story. Of course, everything has to be proved still by the experts. But my understanding is real, and there are two possibilities. One of them, it could be that those bodies of the people who were died or were killed in Mariupol were taken to Manhush, because it's just about 25-30 kilometers outside of Mariupol, and were buried in those mass graves. But another possible, let's say, possibility is that those people were killed in Manhush, because in Manhush was one of the filtration camps where the people were checked by Russians when they were trying to go on the humanitarian corridors and to evacuate from Mariupol. So yes, but everything, of course, can be proved by the experts.
Mr. O'Connor, Russia has demanded an international investigation over the massacres occurred in Bucha. Yet, nothing appeared to the surface, and now we are witnessing the discovery of another mass grave in Mariupol. Don't you think that the West, of course led by the US, are trying to convict Russia and Putin as war criminals without any trial?
Yeah, so I think what this really highlights is just this ongoing narrative warfare, information warfare over this conflict, where the international institutions such as the United Nations typically would step in, perhaps with a tribunal of some sort, but because we're dealing with major powers here, specifically Russia and the United States, there's really not that sort of mechanism that could be used. So what we're seeing right now is both Russia and the U.S. kind of going on their own to either prove or disprove claims. And we've seen, obviously, the U.S. Escalate quite extremely when it comes to rhetoric, going from war crimes to even President Joe Biden saying genocide. And I agree that this is something that needs to be proved by experts at the moment. At the same time, we're seeing, of course, Ukraine, the U.S. as well, starting to collect evidence, trying to build that case. But of course, as I said, it'll be difficult to see where this goes on the World Court, the ICC, because Russia is not a member, neither is the U.S., of course, and there's not really a great precedent for major powers cooperating with such probes. So there's an unfortunate chance that this will be just something that different sides will continue to disagree on, even if evidence is broadcast from either side. It doesn't seem like it could change really people's minds so much at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Sorry to catch your train of thoughts, but Russian officials said from the very beginning, Mr. O'Connor, that they are not looking to take all over Ukraine, but the Western propaganda, as they claimed, fueled the war scene and pictured Russia as the master that will destroy Europe. And here it is now, Russia is focusing only over the eastern part. So do you think that Western media is responsible for the ongoing fight in Ukraine?
Well, I think that prior to this, there was always a view of Russia as the menace. This is something that has been going on since even after the fall of the Soviet Union and NATO kept expanding. This is something that I think did have a significant impact on Russian mentality that predates even President Putin, but especially since President Putin. At the same time, I think that when it comes to the specific situation in Ukraine, a lot of this stems from 2014. And even then, there was still an ongoing bid for Ukraine also to join NATO. Of course, it was accelerated after the fact, the uprising in 2014. And right now, as far as Russia's plans in Ukraine itself, Russia had never really broadcast a specific plan for what it was going to do. It had put out some demands saying a denazification, demilitarization, but most specifically, it talked about asserting control over Crimea, which it already did control, but wants Ukraine to recognize the independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, as well as ensuring that Ukraine was a non-nuclear, non-NATO power. Now, where we are in this course of the conflict is that Russia did try to move into the center of Ukraine more, into the capital, Kyiv, and now seems to be focusing more on the east and the south. And what we saw today was a top Russian military official essentially say that the broader plan is to ensure Russian connectivity from the Russian border through the Donbass region, through to Crimea, which includes Mariupol before that, and the city of Kherson just above Crimea, and then further to Transnistria, a separatist region in Moldova, which would include, of course, taking the Ukrainian city of Odessa as well. So that seems to be where the plan is right now. How this affects diplomacy and Western perception of the war, I think, will remain to be seen.
Perfectly understood. Mr. Alvidas, this sudden move from the capital Kiev toward the eastern part by the Russian troops, don't you think that Russia has failed, or it was the main goal, the Donbass region?
Of course, the main goal was the Donbass region, but of course, Putin underestimated the strength of the Ukrainian army and the will of Ukrainian people. And now it's really interesting, the situation when even in the south of Ukraine, where Russia is doing some called plebiscites or referendums. Of course, it's just like a fake referendums and fake plebiscites. They would like to organize some kind of, like, for example, Kherson People Republic on the north from Crimea. So we do not have support for such kind of referendums. I mean, the people are against, and even some people and even some politicians who had some kind of pro-Russian political orientation, also we've been in the Ukrainian politics, they do not agree to cooperate with the Russian military or administration and Russian occupied forces. So for what Putin decided to do, it's really now to concentrate mainly on Donbass, because this maximum plan did not work. And so, but, well, we, of course, will have to see, is it really possible for Russia to capture the whole Donetsk and Luhansk region? And yes, the corridor from Crimea to Donbass, it's almost in the hands of the Russian military people. But now when I've heard about, again, additional decision or wish to have the corridor to Transnistria and to capture Odessa, I again is thinking that's really more wishful thinking in Russia, and again some kind of grand ideas coming up and not looking to the reality, because at the moment, if we talking that now there is a second stage of the Russian war against Ukraine, and now concentration on Donbass, we don't see even major achievements of Russia in the whole territory of Donbass since this second stage was declared. Of course, the big part of the Luhansk region is taken by Russia. That what was done in the first stage. But even Mariupol is not taken by Russian military.
Perfectly.
Not talking about the center of Donbass region with such cities like Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, Bakhmut, Pokrovsk, and many others.
Perfectly understood. Now, all right, moving on in our discussion, let me highlight this piece of information. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin welcomed the Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal to the Pentagon with a cordon of honor. Prime Minister Denis is on the working visit to the United States. On April 21st and 22nd, he is taking part in a ministerial meeting as part of the 2022 spring meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank Group.
Our most recent packages are tailored to provide the capabilities that will let you and your people counter Russia's changing tactics and to meet the renewed and reckless offensive that Russian forces are launching in the Donbass. All of this underscores our shared determination. The United States will continue to support Ukraine's urgent requirements for today's battles and tomorrow's victories. And we will continue to build the enduring strength of Ukraine's armed forces.
We are winning now, but we need to cement this result and ensure our victory in nearest future. We need continuous supply of firepower, long-range artillery, MLRS, and all such weapons that would give us strategic advantage, and count on continued US leadership in this regard.
So, O'Connor, coming back to you, the professor and the well-known linguist Noam Chomsky, before the 24th of February, he criticized directly United States policy toward negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, and he said that the West is to blame. They pushed the escalation forward. In other words, they sacrificed Ukraine for their interests. What are you saying about this?
Well, I think that probably one of the most difficult things going into this was the fact that NATO had never had actual realistic plans of wanting to accept Ukraine. And we knew this it was an open secret, and even Ukraine realized this. So when Russia said that Ukraine must not join NATO, and NATO and the US refused to basically to not allow Ukraine to join or to cancel its bid for membership, it sort of becomes a conflict on principle. At the same time, the thinking in the West was that as soon as they did remove that membership bid from Ukraine to join NATO, that Russia would have invaded no matter what, because then it would essentially be a green light to do so. So that is the duality going into this. And again, it goes back to this conflict over narratives. Going into this conflict, the Russians had said over and over again, there's not going to be a military operation. Of course, then there was a military operation, but they spun it by saying essentially that this is something that was imposed upon us by the security conditions in Europe that really date back to the fall of the Soviet Union, that NATO expanded unopposed. And I think there's truth kind of to both narratives in that sense. And I think that Russia certainly sees Ukraine as a strategic piece of territory, and perhaps not even a sovereign nation, but it sees it as a strategic piece of territory, of course, with deep historic and cultural links to Russia. And while other countries across the former Eastern Bloc have joined NATO, this was their red line, I believe. And I think the initial strategy back from 2014 was to ensure that separatists that are friendly with Moscow and friendly with the Russophone sort of region were involved there. And just as they were in Georgia and in Moldova, two countries that, well, Moldova doesn't want to join NATO, but two countries that now certainly would not join NATO because of their presence, the presence of Russian forces and separatists. And to do that in Ukraine as well, but that bid was never stopped. So I think that this is kind of the result of both Russia's designs in the region and, of course, the product of a deteriorated security situation for Russia as a result of NATO expansion.
Perfectly raised points. Mr. Alvidas, 2 months now since the Russian attacks occurred on Ukrainians, but until now, Pentagon is moving ahead to help. Couple days ago, they have sent jets and aircraft, and now they receive Ukrainian Prime Minister in their gathering. Don't you think that it is late reception, and don't you think that they are fully backing up Ukraine because they believe Ukraine now is winning?
Yes, I think it's a late decision by the NATO countries to send more serious weapons than this light anti-tank, anti-aircraft weapons. But it's of course better now than later. And I think Western countries understood two main things. One of them, I think, one of the reasons why Western countries did not provide for the Ukraine more serious weapons before the war started, before the Russians started the total war against Ukraine, was not really because they really did not believe that Ukraine will stay, that Ukraine will defend itself against the country, which have a very powerful military forces, and a country which could be really a very big challenge also to NATO countries. I'm not saying about Ukraine, which is not a NATO country. Mm-hmm. So, but Ukraine defended itself, and now Western countries also understood how aggressive is Putin's regime, how far-reaching territorial ambitions might go on, and that he could really try to do something to try NATO, how the NATO is strong, for example, to do provocation, or even attacking of some NATO countries. And when NATO countries decided that it's better to provide for Ukraine serious weapons, that this aggressive policy would be stopped in the Ukrainian territory and will not go to NATO territory.
Mm-hmm. It's better late than never, as you said. U.S. Treasury Secretary Yellen warned on Thursday that European ban on Russian gas and oil imports risks soaring energy prices around the world, calling for reducing European dependence without penalizing the entire planet.
Europe clearly needs to reduce its dependence on Russia with respect to energy. But we need to be careful when we think about a complete European ban on, say, oil imports. And counterintuitively, it could actually have very little negative impact on Russia, because although Russia might export less, its price it gets for its exports would go up.
So, O'Connor, what is your prediction of the growth of the world economy? How could the lingering war affect world economy further? What should we brace ourselves for?
I think the conflict will end up being very disruptive, especially in the short term. In the long term, I think that major actors and the major economies will take steps to try to stabilize things. I think that probably one of the most difficult things to anticipate will be how Russia operates in the long term under such sanctions that are somewhat unprecedented, especially for a major power. You know, we've seen other countries under U.S. sanctions or even international sanctions, such as Iran, North Korea, Syria, and they've managed to adapt, of course, with great adversity, but they've managed to stand. But this is a country now, Russia, which is very integrated into the world economy. We've not seen a situation like this before. So I'm sure that Russia will find outlets to continue doing trade with some of its partner countries. You know, we talk about the world rallying against Russia, but we have to remember this is largely still confined when it comes to sanctions to the West and its most immediate partners and allies, much of the world still remains neutral, or perhaps some even Russian leaning on this, including major economies which are neutral like China and India on this conflict. So I think that Russia will continue to do trade. I think it will suffer economically, of course, and I think we're just starting to begin to really see those effects in Russia. That will take some time to really materialize, something that even President Biden, even if it has the desired effects, these sanctions, said it would take a little bit of time for that to really materialize. So as far as the world economy, I think that the other risk that this runs is that as those effects to the greater world economy start to really take hold in countries in the West, we may start to see a collapse, or let's even just small fissures and schisms in the unity that the NATO camp has really started to uphold. We might start to see countries wanting to do trade with Russia saying, well, the conflict has calmed down, or Russia's pursuing more limited goals. Why can't we take these X and Y sanctions off? That's something that we could start to see, and we're already starting to see that in some ways with the oil and gas bans. We're starting to see countries saying, no, we need to continue doing business. Yes, we understand we have to minimize our dependence, but that still is something that is going to be very difficult, I think, to implement in the long term, and it could end up having effects on that broad coalition that the U.S. and its allies have been able to assemble thus far.
Perfectly understood. To the point of minimize our independence, Mr. Alvidas, do you think that Italy, Germany, Europe in general can replace the Russian gas rapidly as they make it seem? Because weeks ago, high-ranking Italian officials were in Algeria and in the Gulf countries for this purpose, finding a replace for Russia's energy products. What alternative does the world have for Russia and Ukraine grain and products?
Well, Algeria becomes really a very important country in these circumstances for the various European Union countries regarding the interest to get more gas for the industry. Of course, now I have to say that discussions took place already and taking place in such countries of Germany, for example, about, first of all, about some kind of embargo or decision not to buy oil from Russia. And secondly, also to look what is the real energy policy is in Germany regarding various sources of energy which could be used. And of course, for the Germany, we all understand one of the biggest problems that that Germany decided to finish with the nuclear with the nuclear energy, and just to switch to the alternative energies. And of course, when there is a very high reliance on the gas, particularly coming from Russia. But to my understanding, the understanding of threat is so big now in the various European Union countries, maybe not all, but I mean in quite many of them, about this kind of Russian aggressive policy, that those countries already decided that we might take the sacrifice some of the economical interests, some of the benefits, having in mind that maybe Russian gas is cheaper than, for example, American gas or, let's say, liquid gas coming from the Arab countries. But that is the reality, and Putin could blame only himself on what he did in Ukraine. And I don't think really that, for example, his relations with China will compensate that, because the Chinese are looking to this situation and we're asking for much lower prices for the energy than Moscow is suggesting to them. So wherefore, yes, the main player and the main benefits might be in the Chinese pocket, and Russia could really sacrifice because it's a policy in Ukraine.
Understood. The Russian foreign minister responded to Moscow's considered unfriendly actions of 3 Baltic states on Thursday by closing their councils and declaring their staff persons non grata. In a tit-for-tat policy, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had previously announced their decision to close the Russian consuls.
In addition to bolstering Ukraine's resistance on the battlefield, we're also demonstrating our support for the people of Ukraine. Today, the United States is announcing that we intend to provide an additional $500 million in direct economic assistance to the Ukrainian government. This brings our total economic support for Ukraine to $1 billion in the past 2 months. This is money the government can help use to stabilize their economy, to support communities that have been devastated by the Russian onslaught, and pay the brave workers that continue to provide essential services to the people of Ukraine.
Mr. O'Connor, briefly speaking, do you think that Russia has the right to prevent countries from joining NATO based on the idea that NATO is a huge threat to Moscow and this military alliance is growing over the ravage of Soviet Union?
So the important line here that we've heard from Russia in this regard has been that countries are free to choose their own security alliances, but they cannot come at the expense of other countries, which, of course, when we look at the bloc system that was devised during the Cold War, alliances have always been at the expense of other countries. That's really the intrinsic value of being in an alliance. And I think that the ongoing complaint of Russia has been that the Cold War is over. Why does NATO still exist, and why is it growing? And of course, why is the U.S. allowed to deploy nuclear weapons in various non-nuclear countries on the European mainland? So that has been the Russian grievance here. At the same time, we have to separate some of the ways that perhaps Russia has, or during the Soviet times, has expanded in the past. With how NATO is expanded, because we are seeing countries choose to their own volition to join this alliance. So it's a difficult debate, and one that has been going on for decades now. But the people who have been critical, and not just in Russia, but I think in the U.S. as well, of NATO expansion warned that unabated, that a situation like the one that we're in right now could happen. One that basically envisions Russia in a corner reacting to an expansionist NATO. And that's something that I think has some credence right now, because we are in this situation. And if NATO expanding had produced Russian bad behavior in the past, well, just repeating that over and over again produced essentially the same results. Now, of course, there was an effort back late last year to begin security talks from the U.S. and NATO on one side and Russia on the other. We saw demands issued by the Russian side. We saw the U.S. and NATO refusal of those demands, and there's been some question as to how serious those demands on the Russian side actually were, or whether the pieces were already in motion to conduct this military operation. But of course, it speaks to the fact that NATO expansion has still been central to this from the Russian perception, central to this conflict. And of course, Ukraine in a special position, as I think, intrinsically valuable to Russia, a country that Russia does not view as having the right to join NATO, especially under a leadership that's pro-Western.
Understood. Mr. Alvidas, it is good to be a NATO member this time or not? And how Lithuania is going to deal with this decision?
Of course, it's very good to be a member of NATO, and not just to be member of NATO, but also contribute to the NATO according to the capacity of each of the country. So, coming back to the question about Ukraine and Georgia, we have to remember this NATO summit of 2008. And I would say, my position is that Putin would not go for attacking Georgia and in 2008, and now to attack Ukraine in 2014, and now it is total war in 2022. If, let's say, Ukraine and Georgia would be accepted as members of NATO, I would go even farther on. I would say if Baltic states would not be members of NATO, I believe that we would be the target of this very aggressive Russian policy in the region. And what Putin gets, what he's getting from this kind of policy, he's getting the opposite result. So now it's quite possible Finland and Sweden will join NATO, and that not only because we were thinking about this membership of NATO, let's say before 2014. No, those countries were always regarded to be neutral as the best choice for their security. But because we see such unprecedented aggressive policy of Russia, which sometimes remind the policy of Hitler and Stalin in the middle of the 20th century in Europe, these countries decided, probably will make decisions to become members of NATO.
Understood. Mr. Alvidas from Lithuania, Mr. Tom O'Connor from USA, thank you so much for being with us. We have reached our limited time for this show. Thank you so much for your presence. Really appreciate it. And to this point, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. A special coverage will be held also tomorrow. Take care of yourself and have a blessed evening.